everybody, and welcome to the NEWSPASTE Podcast. I'm Johnny Vedmore, your host, and I'm here today with a man who makes me very excited because he's very much like me. You can find him at iaindavis.com. Am I giving away who he is? Yeah. He used to be in this together, I believe, once upon a time, but I got too much. So you've just gone by his name like I did with johnnyvedmore.com, but now I've gone off and I've set up my own NEWSPASTE, and I am happy to announce that some of his articles are already available to find on NEWSPASTE, the links to them, so you'll read the first paragraph and then be taken off to wherever the article does lay. And he has articles all over the place, everywhere from Unlimited Hangout to UK column, Geopolitics and Empire, of course. He also writes books on his third now, which I'm very excited because eventually this guy is going to be able to tell me how to write a book, because I've had a little bit of experience here or there, but there's a few books that I've been interested. Of course, Iain Davis, how are you?
Oh, I'm very well, thanks, Johnny. Thanks very much for having me on. My advice to you is, if you're thinking about writing a book, is don't write a book.
Yeah.
Talk about sucking up your life.
Yeah.
They writing books is it's a big chunk of time out of your life where you can't really do anything else, and that's the problem that I find with writing books, because it is very, very time consuming. I mean, as you know, when you're writing articles and researching stuff, it's the research that takes the time. So, if you're going to put a book together, that takes a lot of time, the research. And then once you've done it, I would say that the bit that takes even longer is the editing. The editing just goes on and
Yeah.
on and on.
Oh,
So
isn't it
it's just,
so?
yeah.
As a writer, like, the editing process is something that is so frustrating. You want to just hand it off to somebody else and you hope. And some people do that. Some people take your articles and edit them good because they don't want them to go up. I mean, if people saw how my articles were originally written, it's basically like man first writing letters on stone.
Yeah.
So they're not very structured. So how long does it take one to write a book, would you say, from start to finish? How long, with life going on in between?
I think the last one took me about nearly the best part of a year. So I think it was about I purposefully took off a few months from writing anything else. I just focused on the book, and I managed to get the bulk of the book done in about 5 months, something
Okay,
like that.
right. Yeah,
But
yeah.
then and as I said, but then you start with the editing process, and then you start with I must admit, and I have to apologize to many people that probably got earlier editions of my last book, Pseudo Pandemic, because that wasn't edited very well. I probably put it out too early. And subsequent editions were much better. The editing was much better. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm for my when I was a kid, I went to school and I was part of an educational experiment called ITA. So
Yeah.
the idea was that they would teach children to spell phonetically, initially at about 3 to 4 years, 4, 5, 6 years old, and then teach them to write English correctly at a later stage. So the idea was to get children just to get children writing earlier. But consequently, the net effect of that, and I've spoken to quite a few other people that were my age. So I was at school in the mid 70s, who have basically become dyslexic. But we're not dyslexic.
Mm-hmm.
We're not actually dyslexic. If I concentrate, I'm not dyslexic. But if I'm writing quickly, words like because I'll spell BEEKOZ. I can't seem to shake that. Consequently,
This is intriguing to me because I've not only, I mean, we brought up under the same sort of school system, but we're probably, I don't know, what year are you born is
well,
probably.
I'm 53 now,
So
so
you're 10 years, you're a decade older than me,
yeah.
which is what I kind of expect. I've seen, I mean, I got two older sisters, and I've got a lot of people I've known from the past who brought me up, in a sense, some rogues and vagabonds, who they all have issues with reading, and I myself was my mum was called in and I was said I was dyslexic at the age of 4, but I would get over it because I read really well, so I couldn't write very well apparently. But I think that was something. There's something within the system that I mean, you're talking about a experiment that's easy to kind of get a grasp on happening, and you can say that was definitely because of that. But do you get a feeling through that period they were just stumbling through their processes and seeing what worked or what didn't?
Well, it's quite ironic that that so many years later that I've ended up writing about this kind of thing, because what this was an ill thought through policy.
Mm-hmm.
It was just an idea. It's like some educational subcommittee somewhere looked at some American research and thought, oh yeah, that's a great idea, let's try that. So they were experimenting. It was an educational experiment, and I think there was a fair few schools that were involved in it at the time. It only went on for about 3 years. And it was quite prevalent where I grew up on the south coast of England. I think also in London. There was other places like York and places like that I think they did it. So it was an experiment that they were trying out on kids. And I know the intention was to do, quite a good idea, to try and get children to be able to write earlier than they normally could. But it backfired. It didn't work. So that was an experiment that went wrong. But nonetheless, that's still, fortunately, throughout my education, it didn't affect my education too greatly. But I know a lot of kids that it did. Their ability to, their comprehension and stuff in English wasn't what it should be. And
were those kids fodder for the creation and the design and implementation of a potentially better system?
I think that was the plan. That was the plan, but it didn't work out. And I mean, I suppose the argument is then, well, how do you try these things? I mean, sooner or later, you've got to try this stuff. But they did try it on a hell of a lot of children all in one go. And I mean, I understand the argument about kind of, study group size and all that sort of stuff. I get it. But nonetheless, this was a lot of children. We're talking, tens of thousands of children in one go.
Yeah.
So maybe that's not
consequences that ring through time. And I see this I feel that there was a range of experimentation going on kids through the 70s and 80s, and it's kind of goes hand in hand with what I've been researching about how education was for the masses was manipulated and kind of refought in the 1960s by these people in American policy institutes like Hudson Institute and the like, where the as I mentioned in one of my Schwab pieces, the auxiliary paper in education that was written in 1966 to 1968 by the real Dr. Strangelove, Herman Kahn, really looked at educating the masses in separately to the leaders. And of course, we do a lot of work on this ourselves. So to see the process and how they then focused on the schools and what they did in the schools, then it seems that they lost a certain portion of their quantity of ethics. They left it behind in the 70s and 80s by saying, okay, now we've separated our kids from their kids. We started that process, so now let's experiment on their kids. And that's how I feel the process. I feel it's even though we can see it was done for the right reasons at a ground level, anybody can be given the right reasons to anything, can't they? If it's the right time and place and the centered in the air, because that's how everybody jumps on bandwagons. That's a really interesting way to start off, because really I feel that in you. When I look at your work, when I talk to you, I get this whole feeling that you've had a very similar experience to me, and that we are people who were not necessarily trained to be writers or meant to be writers, but we're on this path. So when was it that you became the writer that you are now? What was the moment where you realized, I'm a journalist, or I'm a writer, I'm an investigator, or whatever you consider yourself as?
I've always been very, despite ITA, despite going through that, I've always been very keen on writing. When I was a kid, I used to write a lot of poetry. I used to do kind of public speaking competitions and all that kind of thing, although that some people might find that hard to believe now. But I've always been kind of interested in reading. I've always been a reader. I've always been a writer. So I've enjoyed that all my life. I was always writing stories. Big thing that I was into when I was a kid was writing comics. I used to write my own comics. So I was into all that sort of stuff. And then when I was working, I used to write for kind of like trade, like the local kind of office broadsheet, that kind of stuff. And then I was involved in the unions. I used to write a little bit for the unions and that kind of thing. But really, I suppose I really started writing in earnest probably about 2000-ish. And I just purely, no, it's probably a bit later than that. What am I talking about? It's probably 2008, something like that, when I was just writing a blog purely out of interest. I was just writing about the things that I was interested in, and the things that I was interested in were kind of following 9/11, really, I suppose. And I have to say about 9/11, I didn't pick up on 9/11 until probably about 2005, something like that. I was still kind of pretty much. I felt uncomfortable about it. I knew that there was something not right about it, but I hadn't given it much thought, to be frank. I was just getting on with my life and working, really.
I felt I have to say it felt like a ramrod right inside me as soon as it happened. It was like, for me, it was this. I didn't become. I don't see myself as becoming a journalist till about 2016. But I'd already started investigating from that moment. I just kept boxes of all of the papers. I went out, I kept all of the papers from work, and I tried to look through them all and tried to understand what was going on in real time. And I realized that truth wasn't there. The truth wasn't there. And then like 2003, 2004, around that time was Loose Change, and it just like mind blowing, opening up everything. And I remember some people, if people woke up then, they would go crazy. That's what I remember. In the late 90s and early noughties, I had experiences of people who opened their eyes opened their inner eyes to what was going on around, and went absolutely berserk afterwards, because the whole reality for them just dropped and no one else was on board. No one else. So we've already gone through this fantastic process. And so what was it that made you, what was it that had you with 9/11? What was it that got you turning in circles?
Well, I think the first thing is that when I remember I was at work at the time when it went down, when the Twin Towers collapsed, and everyone was kind of gathered around the TV at work. And I worked in a large mental health institution, so everyone was kind of gathered round and looking at this and watching it. And I remember at the time looking at just a question that popped into my head. I thought, how did they get not knowing anything about it, just think, how did they get the explosives in the towers? How did they get them in the towers? Because obviously a plane can't make a building do that. That's obvious. That seemed obvious to me. So I was expecting that discussion and that debate and the investigation to be looking into those things over the subsequent years. That's what I thought would happen. That it didn't, I always thought was really odd. And then probably around 2005, I can't remember who told me, but we were just talking and they just said, of course, you do realize the whole 9/11 thing's just complete rubbish, right? And that was it. When they said that to me, I thought, well, Well, yeah, I do realise that. Yeah,
Isn't it amazing now? It's
I
just
do
that
realise.
one direct sentence gets right into your head, like
Yeah,
a plane hitting a building. God, it's so weird I mean, story I've told to people a few times is that the real, like, one of the moments where I realized there was something really wrong with the whole thing was that we got raided by the police while we were growing weed. I was just relocating from this property where we had set up a grow room, and we were gonna become millionaires. No,
yeah,
we just wanted to grow weed and not have to pay for weed and etc. And we loved it, so we had gone through all that process. But someone who we had lived with was had a very angry mother who knew that we smoked weed on the property, and her son was like, no, 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 no. And then before you knew it, the police were banging down the door and running up the stairs, and they didn't take any of the grow equipment. They didn't confiscate any of it. They just took the 2 boxes of newspapers that were about 9/11. It made no sense. I was just like, no, come on. And the thing is I was in transitioning from the part. My friends lived there, so I had just moved out. And I was about 2 weeks. It was about 2 weeks after I moved out, and they'd been bothering me for 2 weeks about taking these 2 boxes of newspapers that were really awkward to carry. And the police just came and took them away from me instead. So
yeah.
it was fine. It was a very silly time. But there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot within that, because you haven't only got, of course, September the 11th. It was like it's 2002, 2001, September 11th, 2002. We're starting a war in Afghanistan and Iraq. It's
Yeah,
on
yeah,
its way. You know, we're just like pushing towards where we are now, which is when I say pushing towards, it's just it's not pushing towards anything, because it's perpetual warfare. So it just never goes anywhere. So it's like, oh, look, there's
yeah,
war
yeah.
in Afghanistan again, and loads of things get blown up, and the military industrial complex makes some bang for a little bit of time. So you got September the 11th. Where was your journey into the independent media? Who took you on this road? Who were the people that once you started writing like that and started to get a bit more serious, that you look around? Because I'm just explaining my own journey. It's like you look around and you see the same faces that you look back on now and say, oh man, if they wanted to get rid of anybody, they should have got rid of those people. Who
Yeah.
were the ones that opened your eyes?
Well, I think very much the people that I liked were the people that were quite serious, I guess, and dry, and were and offering the evidence, and not trying to jump to conclusions too much. So I wasn't a big fan of the kind of American kind of
Alex Jones bombast.
Yeah, yeah. Although, Alex Jones did some reasonable stuff, I have to say,
Yeah,
early on.
of course. I mean, if you got
But
any dialectic going, then you just have to have your opposing force there, and
yeah, but I mean,
Alex Jones was that.
yeah, and I think Alex Jones is obviously a businessman, and I think
Mhm.
I was aware of that. I've always been wary of commercial interests, and
Yeah,
because
people selling you any type of oil or liquid.
yeah, so I come from a tradition of the left, so that I'm not. I wouldn't say that I was particularly ardently anti-capitalist, even when I was, very very much leaning towards socialism, but nonetheless, I've always been kind of wary of the snake oil salesman. So it was people like
Yeah.
James Corbett, uh,
Oh, yeah.
Whitney Webb.
Sorry. He's beautiful man. What a beautiful man.
Yeah, well, I mean, his content is just fantastic. So I
Mhm.
mean, I think the book actually that really kind of made me kind of sit up and think, and this was probably even before I started consuming any kind of quote unquote alternative media, was Brzezinski's Grand Chessboard.
Hmm.
Because I remember reading that, and it suddenly, I mean, I was aware of people like Kissinger and so forth like that, but I hadn't really started taking the real
You're
their
talking about an extremely interesting character who played the minds, played people's minds very well. So, yeah, explain.
yeah. So it was the fact that Brzezinski was putting forward policy suggestions in a very matter-of-fact and dispassionate way, which he outlines throughout the grand chessboard, which is a view of the world as just that. It's a view of the world as just a blank game board that you move pieces around.
Mm-hmm.
And I suddenly realized, hang on a minute, there are people that are in positions of influence and authority that really think like this.
Mm-hmm.
What they're not seeing is that, he's talking about the battle for the Eurasian continent, which couldn't be more pertinent than what we're seeing at the moment with Ukraine. He's talking about that as if it's all about kind of tactics and logistics and maneuvers and investment and how this is going, without connecting clearly in his own mind that what he's actually talking about is the deaths and the war and carnage and the disruption of economies and the destruction of people's lives. That wasn't even, and I'm reading that, I realize that is not even in his mindset. It's not even in his mindset.
The people who he hung around with in his ilk I mean, I think they could possibly be a better way than he describes it, as like a large chessboard or a game board or the like. It's like when I studied John Kenneth Galbraith, he's a really interesting guy who studied under John Maynard Keynes and studied Keynesian economics, and announces the post-Keynesian economic era, and then announces a new era later on. And these guys were watching these grand movements of society and culture and the masses without being able to see the masses themselves.
Yeah, exactly.
They were watching the movement and the epochal change, the eras just rolling over, and a new modern era being created, and the modern era that you became attached to go away and become the past. And they I think they have such a grand understanding of important moments of history that it allows them to play that game. And by that, this returns again to 1960s, 1970s, where they started to really, or 50s and 60s, where they started to clearly define what they had and what knowledge they had that was above the masses, and gave them that ability to view the sway of culture in such a manner, and important, like influential movements in society and trends, I suppose. And they were trying to understand and they defined it, refined it, and separated it out of society. And we're now seeing this split. We're seeing, the Morlocks and the whatever, all opposing each other, being created by this way of thinking that I think attaches to what you're saying there. I mean, he's one of the most Brzezinski. I'm always too scared to say these names. He comes up over and over and over and over again, in so many different ways. He's such an interesting thinker, because he thinks outside humanity, humaneness.
Well, I mean, when you think that he started, what was it, Operation Cyclone was very much which was the arming of the jihadist elements in both in Afghanistan and in Saudi Arabia as well, and which arguably led to. I mean, I'll say arguably. I'll be more firm about that. Which led to the creation of Al Qaeda. That. And the fact, I mean, weird things happen, don't they? So that was part of his strategy for destabilizing the Central Eurasian continent. Afghanistan, geopolitically and geographically, is in a kind of inflection point in the middle of that continent. So for all kinds of reasons, it's often been, obviously it's not been called the graveyard of empires for nothing, because continually empires are trying to take this region, but they're normally confronted with people that are very tough and very resilient, and B, with the competition from other empires. So that it's a kind of place where empires have been throwing arms and subterfuge and been throwing all their kind of stuff into that region for centuries.
That's why there's a good argument to be made. We were talking about this on day zero the other day, that there was a good argument, or at least there was a good argument to be made by there's a school of thought that thinks that Russia, the steppes of central Russia, of Western Central Russia, and below are really some of the most important, and is the center of the world, the stable world. And even though culturally we don't like to look at it like that, that's why some of the most important events happen surrounding there, because it's really massively important that you have this crossroads from the place where this very important part of the world down to all of the rest of the world, and round to all of the rest of the world, which Afghanistan, Turkey, and Iran to an extent, a large extent, Pakistan as well, extremely important to political power games, if you are looking at it as a chessboard. And as we know, these guys look at it like that. I mean, that's what the CFR really, if you look at how they talk and what their meetings included in the past, it was like watching the longest, most boring chess match, where every move would have a committee on 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 a committee, until it took the life out of it. And even the people who existed within the CFR found the level of banality like just beyond anything they had experienced before. So oh man, this is so interesting. We're talking about but you mentioned something back there. Let's get off topic a sec. You were saying you were working in mental health in the UK at one point, were you?
Yeah, no, I've worked in mental health and I've worked in substance misuse, mainly like sort of latterly towards the sort of the last 10 years, 12 years, I was working mainly in substance misuse.
Oh,
So
sorry. I also worked at substance misuse. There you go. Sorry about that. No, I worked with kids with autism, and I did a little bit of mental. It's like the hardest work possible, and you just seem like obviously the type of guy who would be able to handle doing that for a certain period. But how long did you work in mental health for?
Well, I on and off, because I worked with various different client groups. So I've also worked with adults with autism. I've worked with adults with learning difficulties. I've worked with mental health, adults with mental health. One thing that I studiously avoided throughout my working career was working with children. I just couldn't face it. I just couldn't. Because I remember when I was working with I worked on a project in Portsmouth where we were helping. It was called the High Impact Patient Project. So what we were doing is we were working with people who's presented a significant cost impact, and that is the bottom line. It was about the cost impact that they presented to emergency services. So we're talking about individuals that are costing, say, for example, the local ambulance services hundreds of thousands of pounds a year with call outs and so forth. So highly what they called hard to reach families, right? Now, it always, whenever children were involved in that situation, and when I was going into households where it was unsafe, it was not safe for a child to be growing up in that environment. I would always raise a safeguarding concern to the child safety teams and local child safety teams, and would never hear anything else about it. Would never hear anything about
black hole void. Yeah,
and then there were other occasions where you'd be concerned about the welfare of a child, and you'd kind of try and bring that up in. So there were situations where I had to be part of what they call TAC meetings, which is team around the child meetings. So you would raise these significant concerns. I'm working with a family where there's violence, where there's drug abuse, where there's alcoholism. This child's not safe. Nothing would happen. And then, but then, I would be involved with other team around the child meetings where they would say to me, I might only be working with one of the parents, for example. So all I would know about that parent is that they were working through their program. That was all I would know about them. I've never even met the child. I don't even know. I've never been to their home environment. I don't know anything about their home environment really, because I'm meeting the parent in another location, in a GP surgery. So they would ask my opinion, say, well, what do you think? What do you think about the safety of the child? And I would say, and this has happened to me on a number of occasions in TAC meetings where I would say, well, I can't give you an opinion because I don't know the circumstances of the child. I hear what you're all saying, but I don't have an opinion because I haven't been privy to that information other than what you've just told me. I've got no experience to base my opinion on. I've got no evidence to base my opinion on. And they would say to me, you have to give an opinion because it's part of the process of the team around the child meeting. You can't just say, I don't know. I'm indifferent to this issue because I don't know what the circumstances are. All I know is
you put your
you have to give an opinion. So and things like that would make me, I've always
that drowns out focus. That drowns out focus. That means that you this is something really important. Equality of thought or insight or something automatically being given to everything, whether or not something is the right thing or the wrong thing. And it's something we see expressed in society within transgender debate and other things nowadays. Everything's equal, so you have to then accept these other rules on top of it, and that's why it's masked, it's cloaked, it cloaks the real issues. The way not to tackle real issues is by making them equal to issues that are unreal or have no sort of like emotional attachment to them. Make them equal, and then you take the emotion out of the one thing. Anyway, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I know. That's a good point. When you're working you ask about working in those kind of environments for, a number of years, well, in my case, for more than, best part of 25 years, 30 years. It does become a job. You can't get away from that, even though you're dealing with, and which is part of the, it was my my personal emotional vulnerability that wouldn't allow me to work with children because I was just too emotional about the subject. So that was one of the reasons why I chose not to work or try to avoid it. When you're a qualified social worker, you have to work with children when you first qualify, or that was the state anyway when I was studying. So you have to qualify. You have to work with children, and I didn't want to do that. So I avoided that.
I understand it. I understand it perfectly well because I went and worked with children with autism, and it was one of the most. I really, some of it. The course, it's like extremes. Some of the most amazing feelings and some of the darkest, most horrible sights. The saddest moments, the most like you can't even describe how some of these kids have to live every day. It's not about their surroundings, or you can give them the nicest facilities in the world, but when you're talking about kids who cost a lot of money to ambulance services, in the place I was in, I worked for a company that had 2 or 3 facilities in Cardiff. They were very lovely places. And the 2 kids in our section who were the most expensive cost about 250,000 a year just to house. The companies would not go any low because the amount of insurance. One kid was nonverbal he'd get obsessed about things, so like he had to touch a certain thing, but then it'd be outside the door of the facility, and then he'd beat himself bloody to get to that thing, and you can leave and do it, but then you get into a negative cycle, and it's all sorts of things. Some of the kids were just fantastic. They were mind blowing, and others were tragic. The tragedy is so hard to deal with. I didn't last amazingly long in that field. I had worked in hotels for years and years, and I thought I want to do it for a while. And it was mind breaking to work with children who were in such crisis nearly every day, all of the time, all around you, and to watch the sadness. I worked with one girl who could lift up multiple men and throw them across the room when she was angry, and she was tiny, skinny. You see things that are just
yeah, there's
like
some
beyond.
yeah, there's some incredible. I've seen people in well, the SRA, some spontaneous rage attack. So you get this overwhelming rage. Just do it's well superhuman things. Just do incredible feats.
When she kicked off, or when she started saying certain words, there were certain terms. She used to talk and be, interactive, and then something happened at one point. I mean, psychologically, people think she went through a lot of different abuse, and when she was younger, and they think that somehow just like switched her, took over in her at one point, and she lost her ability to talk because of just some sort of sadness attached in with autism and schizophrenia and all sorts of other things. This girl was a tragic case, and she was 19 and in child's facility because there was nowhere that would take her, because she was so amazingly I sat with her one time, sat opposite her, and she was writing on she was scribbling. I've still got the scribbles actually up on my wall somewhere. She was scribbling down. She used to do numbers and stuff, and she used to say certain words over and over again as she did it. And there was this room full. It must have been about like 5:45. So the two shifts were handing over, and there was loads of people. It was a room full of people. And they'd all had their experiences with her. I'd never had any negative experiences with her, because I believe it's because she probably liked the fact that I didn't treat her like mollycoddle. I just talked to her, and then I was just like nice to her, and she responded really well to certain people who just treated her like a human, of course. I mean, it just seems very obvious, but you can't be sure because of the way her mind worked. You can't be sure. I remember I was sitting on this table, and she said a certain set of words, and it's her trigger words, and the whole room, no word of a lie, emptied out in a matter of 2 seconds, 3 seconds, just 20 odd people just disappeared out the door, and there was just a couple of heads popping round as I sat with this girl who was repeating these words on this table while scribbling down these things, and like I refused to like go at first. I was like, and they were like, oh, okay. And I got up and left and walked out with them and played that part of the game. But she was extremely dangerous, and there was reasons why all of those things were in order. And I'd seen her be restrained by 7, 8 people with 10 people on standby, and her lift up out of a sofa, and she was the skinniest little rake of a thing. It was insane.
Yeah, and then obviously afterwards, what that causes that person is incredible fatigue. Then they go into a fatigue state for maybe days, maybe weeks.
She would at first, the first thing she would do was kick the sideboards. She'd go repeat. She'd do a process of pattern of repeating, where she'd go up to a sideboard and she'd just slightly kick it, and then she'd turn around, walk up to another sideboard and slightly kick it. And then she'd walk across the room to the next sideboard and slightly kick it. And she'd just go through that process for a couple of hours until then she hit into fatigue.
Yeah. It's and I mean, I adopted the same approach as you, mate. I mean, I always spoke to people with respect and treated them as just the same as I would treat anybody else. I mean, I never drew a distinction between people because they had maybe very complex needs. And I adopted the same approach when I was working with people with mental health conditions. and when I was working with people with drug and alcohol dependency problems.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, that I saw no reason. I mean, the way I used to look at it was, I see no reason to treat these people any differently. You know, I mean, obviously with respect to their needs, and, you know, being aware of their needs and how that they could be met. But nor do I see any reason why their behaviour should be treated any differently either.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, with clients that were aggressive towards me, no matter what their needs were, you know, when at an opportune moment, I would just say, I really didn't appreciate your behaviour. I really didn't appreciate it. I don't like being punched. I don't like being kicked. So please don't do it again.
Yeah.
And I found, and I, honest to God, I found that approach, I would not be. I mean, people always used to say to me, because I'm quite a big bloke, I'm quite physically quite big, and people say, "Oh, well, you didn't get hit because you're a big guy." And I thought, well, that's a silly argument, because that's suggesting that the person that is in that state knows what they're doing, and I think often they don't. So that doesn't ring true. But I think it's to do with who they feel safe with. And I think because often I think these kind of outbursts of rage and anger, usually it stemmed to a failure to communicate. There's some unmet need there. So who are you going to communicate with to get your needs met? How are you going to do that? Well, it's the people that they feel safe and comfortable with. And one of the interesting things I would say to you, I wonder if you'd have stayed sat at that table, if that would have been reassuring enough for her not to kick off. Because when you leave, she's got no one that she's on a level with. Who can she communicate with? How is she going to get this need met? Then she kicks off.
I really found I knew that if I stayed there, she would be fine. And I also knew something else. I felt, at least, that the majority of the people treated her that way, and the way that these guys did, and that she did not like those people and never forgave them for how they reacted. And that stayed with her, and how she acted with different people, and her level of anxiety was increased with working with certain people, not others. And I like to think that I was listen. I mean, there's so many challenging situations with some of the guys. I was mainly on with this one boy who was just, wow, he was a special case. He could put his hand up his own bum and find a weapon to
manually evacuating as well.
Yeah, and then come for you. And you just knew his head would turn to the side when he went.
Yeah, that's quite often that kind of cocked head.
Yeah,
there's a lot of things that, you know, there's a lot of research that hasn't been done for these people.
Yeah.
I think there's so much more that we could, about how to communicate with them effectively. I remember the old flipup cards. I don't know whether you ever worked with them, but with people with autism that could recognize that symbols were something that they could relate to more easily. And I mean, I'm talking with people at the severe end of the non-verbal end of the autistic spectrum. Now, I always thought that card system, I always thought, well, why can't you adapt that for other needs as well? For people that are, you know, for example, people with severe anxiety, who are so anxious that they can't even verbalize. Why not adapt that system? You know, and then, you know, I suppose during my working life, I had an opportunity to try and maybe bring some of those things about, but I didn't either. So, I mean, I don't know quite, you know, but
because you have to have humanity at the top, or humaneness at the top, if you want to have all of these things implemented, and you want changes that are going to be positive.
I mean, one of the things that I wrote about on my original About Me page on my website when I first started is that I got made redundant again. Right now, I have been made redundant. Oh, I don't know how many times I've been redundant, but you know, probably, you know, if you're working in the social care sector, if you're working for a private provider, So I've worked in both the statutory and the private sector. If you're working in the private sector, that's all done on a contract basis. So every 3 years, normally with a local authority, that contract comes up for retender. Most of my often I'd be working, and the last year of my life would be nothing but bid writing. So of my working life with that group would be bid writing. So you invariably find if you don't get the contract, then services have to be, that service may well go under, or it might relocate to another region, or you might get a new contract somewhere else. Now you might not want to move to that region, so you might have to leave that company. So it's a very unstable industry to be
and the
in.
companies get taken over all of the time, and they rely on so much on agency staff that it leaves them disrespecting their own staff, because what they do is, and you'll know this very well, is they'll make us work really, 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 really hard at a really high level of training to get everything completely right. And then they don't have enough staff, so they just employ a load of agency staff that have zero training, and you've got this juxtaposition between the two, where you're suddenly like trying to stop the other person doing the wrong thing all the time, or trying to watch their behavior because they're not used to dealing with in these situations. They've just turned up for a job one day. That's what they do. They just turn up for a job one day, and they find that they're put with a kid who's got real trouble and issues that they've never seen before. And it's like, you go through all of this training to learn. It's such a hard industry to work within.
It is. It's very hard, but at the same time, there are other times when you just can't believe that you're getting paid for doing this kind of stuff. I remember, like going on holiday with clients, or supporting clients one-to-one, and going swimming or something like that. So you go to the swimming baths, and you spend the morning swimming about, and suddenly you think, hang on a minute, I'm getting paid for doing this. This is great.
I did like a bit of that.
And then, but there is the downside, and the downside is having to deal with very challenging situations sometimes. And also, I think one of the problems that happened, with community care and I blame Thatcher for this, but then I blame Thatcher for a lot of stuff. So.
Me too.
But when the whole community care thing started, and they decided to close down the large institutions and move people out into the community, the assumption was that the institutions were all bad. Now, I worked in some of those institutions, and then I worked in the community as well. Now, I would suggest that some of that. Let me give an example. I worked in a community home in Bristol, and the residents of that community home were all older residents who had all previously lived in a large residential unit, a large hospital, basically a hospital secure accommodation. So at that hospital, some of those residents, they had like a kind of, I'll give an example. One guy that I work with, a client that I work with, he used to be able to go to the tuck shop in the hospital grounds. So he was free to wander around in the hospital grounds. He was free to go, and it quite pleasant grounds, sculpted nice gardens and all that sort of stuff. He could walk around that all day. He could go to the tuck shop to buy his fags, and he wouldn't get ripped off, right? So, because he didn't have any concept of money, he didn't know anything about it. So they would give him his fags, and he'd give them £10, even though the fags this was a long time ago, even though the fags were a couple of quid, and they wouldn't rip him off. They would give him the right change, right? So he could do all of that. Then Thatcher decides that's a bad idea, that we're not doing that anymore, because in her mind it was cheaper to put people into these.
You think that's what I keep on the train of thought, but do you think that's because it was cheaper?
Yeah, it was financial. I think.
Okay.
I think they thought it was cheaper.
I'll get
they were
back
wrong.
to this.
They were wrong. It turned out to be more expensive, but then they're usually wrong, aren't they? But I think they thought it was cheaper. So they put these people into these community homes, and basically said to this guy, you've now got a little support team around you. You're on your own, mate. It's all part of community awareness. we want you to, if you want a packet of fags, you've got to walk into town and buy a packet of fags, which means he couldn't do that. He couldn't go into town and buy a packet of fags. He was incredibly vulnerable. You know, he would say the wrong thing. He would get himself into difficult situations. He had no concept of money.
Yeah.
And they just took these people out of these institutions and just
Yeah.
said, off you go. Off
Yeah.
you go out into the community. It was just ridiculous. It was a crazy thing to do.
It was astounding, wasn't it? And now what I was going to say is that I kind of like examine the 70s and the 80s a lot when it comes to Britain, and when it comes to America and New World Order stuff and globalism, I kind of look at the 50s, 60s. And 70s, so there's that crossover period of the 70s where I know quite a lot about what was going on both sides of the channels, and it was something much bigger, and it lends us to leads us and lends this conversation well, because it'll lead us towards globalism, because we start off in Ted Heath's cabinet, really, when I talk about this, and he was one of the men who really got on board with the World Economic Forum. He was the president of the World Economic Forum, as you'll know, and really down with the system. I mean, I really want to watch this series. I can't remember what it's called, but when I was researching the second Schwab piece, I watched a couple of them. I think it's named after one of John Kenneth Galbraith's books, but it was a documentary series following his trails in the late 70s and early 80s around Europe with globalist people like Ted Heath, and I'd love to watch all of that stuff. But within Heath's cabinet, you had some really strange people. Margaret Thatcher was one of them, of course, but another one was Keith Joseph, who's one of the most weirdest, horriblest people. He goes right through me when he speaks. There's a brilliant episode of Firing Line with William F. Buckley, where if you watch it and you see Keith Joseph talk and how he talks, it'll make you go, oh my God. He's like sweating. He's having to get his handkerchief. He's talking about his young girls going in care homes. You know, he's really a very strange guy. And he created,
which is saying something in Heath's cabinet, isn't it?
Yeah, I know. Wow, it was full of some quirky folk, that's for sure. And he was the guy who created like social services and the care home system as it was from 1971, 1972. He previously had been the housing minister, if I remember correctly, during the period where they wasted a load of money badly building, giving like shoddy builders loads of money to build massive buildings that all had to be destroyed and brought down the following year, like all over or the following decade, sorry, all over Britain. I know that's covered in a few different places, including Adam Curtis documentary, if I remember correctly. But Keith Joseph was this strange, he created the social services, this care network, to be something much different than people think it was. Personally, I think it was to feed a certain desire within that political class. Power corrupts, and a lot of these people were very powerful and looked at the fact that how can we get what we want, and what do we want? Well, we want do our ruling, then we want to go and we want to get some drinks, and then we want to find some young girls. So or young boys. So how do we go about that process? And I think there was an element of that why Keith Joseph was in charge of setting up social services, partially because of who he put in charge. So down in Kent, you had a very strange man indeed, Nicholas Stacey, who would say the line, I wrote an article about it, say the line, men who are attracted to 13-year-old boys make the best teachers. That was one of his quotes. And he said that in 2000 and something.
And that's the same time, isn't it, when Tim Fortescue was chief whip, and
There was some dodgy things going on. I mean, in context, people don't realize what the sexual revolution of the supposed sexual revolution of the 60s was. It was a co-opted agenda operation to kind of release this sort of like sexual pent-up angst to go over to the next level with them being able to understand how to use sex to manipulate. There's a lot of the intelligence services were trying to release that quantity out, make it everybody feel like they can do whatever, yet when the focus turns on the individual, they suddenly regret everything that they've done publicly, and they're about to go into positions of power and the like. So you've got all of the compromise and you've got all of the ability. You convince people to go out and be sexy, and what you'll get is a lot of compromise. And this was the dawn of like sexual compromise operations. Now, on top of that, I think there was a cultural shift, and a positive cultural shift. I say for my gay, lesbian, and bisexual brothers and sisters out there, love you all. And they got recognized, their legitimacy and their legality got recognized at the end of the 60s. And that meant the 70s was a very interesting period, because I really do believe that the people who target children inferred a lot into this sexual equality and the stigma being released about being gay, lesbian, or bisexual. So that meant that suddenly there was a group who, as we know in Britain, we had PI, the Paedophile Information Exchange, who suddenly went to work lobbying behind the scenes politicians. And so if you imagine that these guys are constantly lobbying politicians to change the laws on child sexual exploitation, child trafficking, and child sex all throughout this period, then you can think that these asexual, that's his own words, politicians such as Ted Heath and the like were maybe coming in contact with people who could give them what they desired. And then we see a string of care home scandals where kids were being molested, sometimes by people who were wealthy and in significant positions of
when was Elm Grove? That was the early 80s, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was that reverberated as well. That was kind of late 70s, early 80s, peaked at the early 80s, got exposed a little bit then, and then the owners kind of drifted away and went into sort of like obscurity eventually.
She got killed, didn't she?
Yeah, in about 1990, 1991. She called, it was some journalist or politician or something. She would be like, "Listen, I'm willing to give you all the evidence. Come see me tomorrow." And she was dead.
And then she was dead. Yeah. And it's the same King Cora, wasn't it? King Cora, Elm Grove. They were definitely intelligence entrapment operations, weren't they? I mean, they were admittedly intelligence entrapment operations.
A lot of people don't understand what intelligence entrapment is, though, because it is just like it's been described to me by Whitney and others, like who's been described by other people as a party boat that you get on, you just can't get off. So enjoy the party while you're on board. So all of these people are doing loads of different things that we'll despise, whether it be stealing our money, cajoling our healthcare system, or our education systems, killing people off with bad policy, in whichever way, shape, or form, pumping out experimental drugs or even experimental psychological processes on us. These guys, they don't stop. They don't stop, and we cover all of this stuff.
And it's not getting any better either. I mean, if you look at the number of children that have gone missing from care, so if we look at the number of children that came over from Syria, for example, we're talking about tens of hundreds of children that are just vanished, just gone. They don't know where they are, or this is what the authorities claim anyway. They've got no clue what happened to these children. So whether they've gone into the kind of underground kind of slavery trade, child trafficking. I mean, recently we've seen the UN put out a document where they're trying to normalize basically paedophilia. I mean, they're still, this has been a clear theme that has been ongoing, as you quite rightly say. If we go back to the sort of 70s, and I would argue earlier, 50s, 60s, then there's this theme, of trying to normalize paedophilia. I mean, that they've been trying to do that. Pi being a perhaps a particularly extreme example. The Labour Party support for Pi, which you were right, was all embroiled in the notion of sexual liberation. And this is the clever thing, isn't it? This is the way it works, because for the lesbian, gay community, LGBTQ plus, whatever they want to call themselves now, there was a genuine point. They really were politically oppressed and socially oppressed and culturally oppressed. So they had a real fight. There was a real fight there to be made. So, but within that current, that is then exploited. That genuine struggle, and that's something that we see everywhere. Particularly, we might look at environmentalism at the moment, but that genuine struggle, where there is a genuine cause to be fought, is then piggybacked upon by people who seek to exploit the situation for a cause that has no legitimacy, like paedophilia.
Amen.
That is the way that the thing has worked consistently for decades, and is still working that way today. So if we look at the transgender issue, quite clearly there's and we are seeing it at the moment, certainly with that UN document, for example, there's people trying to piggyback on that to exploit that for, in this case, the normalization of paedophilia. But there's also people trying to exploit it for a transhumanist agenda as well. So, which means that the genuine people that are perhaps feel that they have a case to make for genuine, perhaps, oppression, are then put out as the kind of, if you criticize this movement, you're criticizing them. But you're not criticizing them. You're criticizing those who are exploiting them for their own ends, and their ends are not good.
You're always criticizing those who are making these fallacy arguments all over the place. I mean, this is what we're constantly doing. They're trying to trick people by saying, "Oh, look at things this way, and it seems like this," and we say, "Yeah, but look at things every way, and it is this." And that's the difference. I will put down a challenge to everyone who's listening, all 10 of you or more. At least 10. No, there'll be a few people who listen to this. And I put down a challenge. Come to me on whatever platform you're on and tell me how many children go missing every year in the UK. And you can select a number of years if you want, or just give me just 1 year in particular that you got data for, and come and show me. Because every time I see the data, it fries my mind, and I can't believe that it's possibly true. And I can't understand why people aren't screaming and shouting about it, because you're talking about thousands of kids. And whenever I want to say tens of thousands, and
I'm not going to give it away. I know the answer, and I'm not going to give it away. Let your.
Okay, well, you're going to tell me at the end, but
the end.
It does fry.
It is more than you can possibly imagine. Imagine.
I talked to a couple of police officers. I've talked to people who deal with this sort of stuff. It's so hard to understand. But most coppers say that it's worse than anybody can possibly imagine. The prevalence of people targeting children is something that is more prevalent than the statistics will have you believe. and the coppers say they can't do anything about it and they don't have any powers for it. And of course, that's what they always say. Coppers, I do police auditing, so you can't trust anything a copper wants, because the copper always wants the thing on the side of the thing he should have. So he'll get whatever he wants, and then he'll start eating everything else. That's the problem with coppers. They need to be watched closely, but still they don't have the ability to express this well enough. That this, and I kind of understand it from a perspective of profiling. Like, especially I've been releasing articles recently that studied the profile, some of the profiling, FBI profiling of child sexual people who target children for sex, in this case Epstein and Maxwell, and how really they would be classed as preferential, sadistic preferential pedophiles. Sadistic being a very small portion of preferential pedophiles are sadistic, but they had sadistic qualities if you believe every single thing every witness says. They have sadistic qualities.
Yeah.
Other than that, the majority of the victims actually describe them in terms of just preferential pedophiles. So there's actually only a very small minority who put them in the other profile, but they have to be looked at in that profile because their behavior is obviously narcissistic, and they weren't thinking about the girls at all. So that's mid-level sadism at best, So there's a sadistic element. So it's all a spectrum, of course. Not everybody's, but for profiling, you can best categorize people in profiling terms in certain areas. Now, what most people don't know about child sexual exploitation is the majority of pedophiles, or what we call pedophiles in the current terminology, are situational pedophiles. So they're not, they don't prefer child partners. They prefer adult partners, but situational stress and pressure will mean they will target young people to fill their own the hole in their own ego. Okay. So that draws a massive issue in.
So are you saying they can't form adult relationships, so they target children?
No, they form situational people. Some of them, yes. See, some of them can't form relationships with adults, but those most of those are preferential pedophiles. They prefer relationships with children for that reason. Situational will be completely normative from the outside. You will look at them and they will have a happy life. I've studied, I don't even know what to do. I've got hundreds of people in files elsewhere that I have tried to send over to police, law enforcement, and other people, and they barely want to touch them, because they've got so much work to do and they don't want to be told about more. And yet you keep sending it to them, they'll just ignore them. So I don't even know what to do. I wanted to form a collective. At one point, I went out on Twitter and I said, okay, look at all of these people. These are people that I can come and I can say, I have evidence to prove that they are on this. They like the worst, the ones who are working with children, I went for and got removed from working with children, but the ones who are just out, I don't even know what to do about it, because you can tell by I did this hunting not by trapping people by pretending to be a little girl or something like that, but I used platforms that allowed me just to see names and titles of files and then find and browse that user sharing those titles, and then see if they're sharing any documents alongside those titles, download all of the documents, screenshot their computer to show what they're sharing. Then I've got complete, I mean, I found people share their birth certificate alongside this stuff. So they're just people who are into that sort of stuff are completely and utterly stupid most of the time. They can't help but to do stupid stuff. So they're on a track which they can't get off. They don't know where they're going. And this is what people don't realize. These people are just off in a world of their own. They don't know. They don't see the shit from the shinola. They don't see the wood from the trees and all. And this means they're all out in society, and they're acting normally, but you don't know they exist because they're a massive proportion of mainly men who, for situational reasons, for pressure outside, external pressures, don't feel like they have a full ego enough with their current partner or their life or the way their life's going. And that means they look for an output where they can take out that lack of ego on someone who's weaker, and that nearly always turns out to be a child who they're close to.
Yeah, I mean, I it's difficult, isn't it? Because we need to be able to understand these things in order to protect the child. But it's protecting the child that should be kind of, I think, our focus. But how do you do that?
Once you know it all, you realize that the problem is actually hundreds of times more prevalent than you actually the people say it is, and it may be up to a number of something like 1 in 10 men who are a potential of offending if the situation gets worse.
Most of it takes place in the home, doesn't it? I mean, it's the most common place where child sexual abuse occurs is in the home. So we're talking.
And what happens? Lockdown. What happens at lockdown? What happens in future?
Exactly.
Lockdowns?
I mean, this was a risk that people were trying to point out at the time. You know, that if you put people into this situation, those children that are currently vulnerable, you know, in their home situation, you are going to multiply their risk factors by a massive amount.
That's when you see a situational pedophile become an offender. And that's what people don't realize, is that most situational pedophiles will like see the pressure they get in their, like, let's say maybe they're not doing well in their job, their life's falling apart, their woman doesn't love them anymore, they're cheating on someone, they feel guilty, and they'll express that onto whatever is around them at the time. If that's then multiplied much more over, the more likely they are to then offend and show their true face. So, I mean, is it their true face, or is it like a societal malaise and a forced addiction to infantilizing ourselves that causes all of this? Because that's a lot of what we do in education, is treat ourselves like children. A lot of what we watch is treating ourselves like children. A lot of what we consume is treating ourselves like children. And I get a feeling
certainly, I mean, if you look at government messaging now, who are they targeting at? I mean, it's all cartoons and little bubbly charts and lots of happy music, and it does look like. I mean, when you look at that kind of messaging, you kind of think, well, I remember seeing that sort of stuff on Play School when I was a little baby. What is this? Where is the, you know, if you surely at some point, maybe after 9 o'clock in the evening or something like that, I don't know how it could work. But at some point, you need to communicate with adults, but they don't want to communicate with adults. What they want to do is infantilize absolutely everything. Because if you infantilize everything, then you are blurring that distinction between adulthood and childhood, aren't you? You're deliberately doing that. So
the world is messed up at the moment as well. You look out on social media and you see how people present themselves, and it's often as little girls or dumb people or stupidity or all of the expressions that you'd expect from an ill-educated society. Oh no.
I mean, I'm going back to what you were talking about, the kind of the education system. I mean, the advantages of a classical education, which you know, years ago that separation was made, but as you were saying, between those that were fortunate enough to receive a classical education, which looks at the trivium of how to think critically, which teaches people to think critically. So you are arming a select group of people with an intellectual advantage. Actually, you're giving them tools that you're not allowing the vast swathe of people to have access to. Now,
it's an attack on all sides, isn't it? It's attack on population, it's attack on everything, but it's attack on that too.
So you're giving a select group of people additional tools which they can then employ as adults, because one of the things about thinking about things critically is obviously that you learn that as an adult that comes with additional responsibilities that you didn't have as a child, which is the key distinction between being an adult and a child. You take on the responsibility for the world. You take on the responsibility for your actions. There is a point at which, even probably, when is it? I don't know, probably when we're about 14, 15 years old, that we start thinking about these things naturally. We start taking on more responsibility for ourselves. But if you put that into an educational setting where you are actually saying, once you have the responsibility of being an adult, here are the tools that can equip you to deal with the world around you, and we're going to give you those tools, which is what you get in a classical education. But you don't give those tools to people in every other educational setting. You're creating basically that two-tier society, aren't you? You're correct, regardless of wealth. Forget about wealth, forget about inequality of opportunity. You are actually creating an intellectual schism in the fabric of society, so that one group of people are always going to have an advantage simply because they approach problem solving in a completely different way from everybody else in society. The ultimate expression of that is when you get to someone like Brzezinski or Kissinger or someone like that, because they have taken that approach to the ultimate level. They have taken it to the global perspective, and are applying those same kinds of dispassionate logical approaches to political situations which actually cause great harm and suffering. But they're disassociated from that. They're just seeing it in terms of, moving pieces on a chessboard in a very logical and an uncaring way. Because now they will argue, and they always do argue, Brzezinski certainly did, and I know Kissinger does as well, that they're doing it for a good reason. They're doing it because ultimately this matters. But how is that's like saying, there's some kittens here which they've lost their parent. So I haven't got time to care for these kittens. So the logical thing for me to do is put them in a sack and throw them off a bridge. Right? Because that's the right thing to do. Yeah. Now, that is more or less where people like Brzezinski and Kissinger found themselves at.
Yeah.
That killing and is not necessarily bad.
I think there's a load of people who have to put that put like it's so weird how much influence they got and how much attention they got for saying something that was basically the most extreme view that you could get for their time, the CFR, for their groups and the groups like that. There's so much to this. I me and you could talk for a long time about all of this stuff, because I think we see power in roughly the same way, but we have a slight alternative experience. And these guys really did. Once you see things at the extreme, you can't get down to humanity again. You're lost to it. And a lot of these guys, and then they pass that down to the next generation. And one of the things I was going to say is that, that awesomeness of beholding the extreme of a Kissinger idea, or of how the future should be, the awesomeness like dazzles those in power as being the perfect thing for them, because that will be what keeps them in power. Being aligned with that structure keeps them in power. So it lends to the power hungry of the future to continue supporting a system that obviously doesn't work for
no.
Even the majority of them. Most of them are coaxed on board this train, and this train is now turning into outright globalism. And that obviously started in the early 80s. I say it started a long time before, but that's obviously like the modern day globalism that we see now forming has been brazen since the early 80s. And getting bigger and bigger. And it used to be blocks. It used to be European blocks and American blocks, and soon it's going to get bigger. How likely do you think globalism is to succeed in the next 50 years?
It all very much depends upon what we do, doesn't it? I mean, the whole thing is predicated upon what we do. I mean, their whole propaganda machine is designed to control us. We are, and then rolling out things like the vaccines. It looks like it's designed to get rid of us.
Mhm.
It all depends upon how we react. If we carry on simply going along, I mean, one thing that I despair with, I mean, it was heartbreaking. Was it you that I was talking to about this the other day? Seeing, the people kind of queuing up to celebrate King, what's his
Mhm.
face, getting having his anointment ceremony. What does he
Yeah.
do behind that little screen, eh?
What does he
Does
do
he have to bare his
indeed?
nipples or get on one knee? I don't
I don't
know.
know. I tried not to look at the screen. It was on in my house because I think really my housemate wanted there to be some sort of jihadi nonsense going on, but
Well,
unfortunately there was
was disappointed when it didn't
he,
happen.
I
Yeah,
I think he was. I think he was. He would have loved a
yeah.
bit of that, but just because it's it's all show and drama, isn't it? It's all show and
I mean,
drama.
it's just such a ridiculous spectacle. I mean,
Hmm.
I didn't see it at the day, but I visited my mum the next day, and she wanted to go through it again.
Oh God.
So, I mean, she had her friends round, and they had a nice little tea party, and they enjoyed the
Yeah,
day, and they
yeah.
loved looking at all the dresses and the finery and everything,
This
and
is
they
how
love
they
all
get
that.
it. This is how they keep. This is how
Yeah,
they keep it.
but I was pointing out, at one point, I said to my mum, did you see the protests? Right, so she goes, "No, I didn't see any protests." I said, "No, exactly, you didn't see any protests."
Yeah.
I said, because think about what the guy is doing. The guy is, and now I think we're at danger, and I think one of the reasons why Charlie is so unpopular, and he's so obviously a WEF spokesman, and he's so obviously a hypocrite, that, and he's got all these links to people like Savile and Ball and all that kind of stuff. I do wonder if he's been put up to kind of wind the monarchy down, because I think if you look
Hmm.
at, I mean, I know that they dropped the Bill of Rights Act that they wanted to put through. Someone was saying the other day, I haven't looked at that. I don't know whether they have or not, but they're already talking about this idea of qualified rights and all that kind of stuff. Now, I think one of the dangers that we've got is in getting rid of the monarchy. Now, right, let me put my cards on the table. I am not a royalist, and I do not believe in the monarchy. I do not believe in any kind of that kind of hierarchical political
Hmm.
structure. I don't believe in them. But nonetheless, there are aspects of the Constitution, which I would argue we do have a Constitution. A lot of people would disagree, but I would argue that we do a written codified Constitution. There are aspects of that which are embodied in our contract with the Crown, which is the
Hmm.
coronation, which is verbalized in the coronation oath, which are worth thinking about before throwing them away.
Hmm.
Even though those aspects, like protecting our rights and customs, which he did swear to actually in the oath, I was pleased to see that he did.
Hmm.
Um, Protecting our rights and customs means protecting our custom is the common law. That is what that is referring to, one of our customs, but the primary one is the common law, innocent until proven guilty, trial by jury. Now,
Hmm.
we are already seeing, for example, in Scotland, now they're making these moves to go to rape trials without a jury.
Wow.
Now I was listening to the BBC radio this morning, and there was a spokesman from the a spokeswoman from the SNP who said something that I need to check out. But she said that currently 80% of Scottish criminal trials are heard without a jury.
Mm.
80%, she said. Now
Wow.
I found that
No.
hard to
That's
believe.
so, yeah, that's I mean this is our job though, is we discover information that even after we've discovered it, written it down for other people to look at, repeating it still seems absurd.
Yeah. I mean, I need to check that out. I don't know whether that's true or not.
No, that's
Maybe she
how.
might have just made a mistake. She was on a live interview. She might have made
Mhm.
a mistake, but nonetheless, she said 80%. So, and I think that it is so important that we retain these basic principles which
Mhm.
enable us to function as a society. If we start getting rid of things like trial by jury, if we start adopting Napoleonic law instead of which we've already done to a very great extent, right? If we start doing that kind of stuff, then we are genuinely blindly walking into a totally different social structure than the one that we're accustomed to, without giving it any thought at all. And I think part of that, obviously Charlie is very unpopular, right? He's unpopular, not even amongst royalists. He's unpopular. Most of them wanted William; they didn't want him, right? So he's unpopular. I suspect that this is going to be used as a way of winding down the monarchy, but in doing that, using that, then going back to this thing that we were talking about earlier about people piggybacking on agendas, then using that unpopularity to actually wind down and reimagine the constitution. I think that, and that constitution will fit in with the globalist sense of where we're going. So this will all fit in with and be more closely aligned to European values, which is a completely different set of social and political norms.
Yeah,
I think that is likely to, and I would be very surprised if we don't start seeing that happen. Probably not this year because he's just been crowned, but maybe next year, the year after, that will start building up.
Yeah, I agree with you to a certain extent, and I probably have a little bit of a different vision of what I think he wants. Because personally, I think he wants to be known, he wants to be remembered. That's always a dangerous thing, especially for a guy who you could look at it two ways. Either he can wind down the monarchy just by slowly taking the foot off the gas for a while and taking a different stance. I don't think that's Charlie personally, or you can wind it down by going too far and pushing your boundaries as far as you can push them until there's obvious pushback that'll you don't care about because you're in a frame of mind where you're supposed to do this for this reason until the next generation take over, and then it'll be slate wiped cleaned again. And with William, you've got that slate wiped cleaned again feeling that is approaching. So Charles has, in a sense, his own, can give himself a mandate in his brain to do big things, to do really big things, and to try and make a name for himself. Now, if he fails, he fails, but he doesn't think he can possibly fail at anything he does, because I think he does have this sense. It's amazing sense of Charles I about him. He has it's very intriguing, and
I can't see him being much of a party animal, though. Or was it Charles I? Or was that Charles II who was the party animal?
Yeah, Charles II might have been the party animal, to be honest. I think that's why he was more controllable. He was an interesting guy himself. I did some research into a family called the Heaths family, who get given land in Ireland by Elizabeth I, sorry. And eventually they fight against the British on the battlefield, one of the members of the family, and they have some money confiscated from them, something along those lines. But Charles II forgives them. He forgives he's having one of his party days one day, and he
he's
has
too
his
drunk.
round,
He don't care.
and he's just forgiving people their debts because it doesn't matter anyway. Daddy died in a very bad way. It could happen to me at any time now. better give away all your stuff. He was a one. But there was a great I mean, there was a change when William and Mary took the throne in the UK. Suddenly there was that wind down already that I think maybe Charles leads to. This changing to being a more standard European style of monarchy on the exterior, but underneath they're actually more involved in politics than you can ever imagine. They've got their
he has shown his willingness to get involved in politics, throughout his life. I mean, the spider letters and all that kind of stuff. I mean, he has taken it upon himself to act in a way as a political leader. as a
He has
prince.
no intention. He has no
Yeah,
intention to just be a normal everyday Joe king. He wants to he wants to rule. He wants to do something special, and
yeah.
I
Well,
think
he's aligned
well,
him. That's why he's aligned himself, isn't it, with the people that he's aligned himself with.
yeah,
So his whatever his vision is of the future, which we pretty know is going to be, sustainable development, central bank digital currency,
mm,
all the stuff that nobody wants. This is the stuff he's going to push. This is the stuff. If he wants to make an impact as a king, and I suspect that you might well be right. And I'm just saying that when I was talking about the monarchy being wound down, I didn't mean by him. I don't think for
mhm.
any
I
second.
think it's going to wind down eventually, whatever, and they
Yeah,
all
yeah,
know that. They just predict the future and they do it their way. They know that's what the end result's going to be, whatever.
yeah. But I just think it's important that we also understand what our constitutional position is,
Hmm.
because the crown, although it doesn't work, I'm not. Don't get me wrong. I mean, politicians take an oath of allegiance to the crown.
Hmm.
They never actually observe it. But nonetheless, the mechanisms are there. Should we familiarize ourselves with them, perhaps a bit more than we have done up to
Yeah,
date so far? The mechanisms are there by which we can rule,
yeah,
because in our constitution, the head of state isn't actually some bloke sitting on a throne. The head of state is the crown, which is a body, and the crown has a contract with us. We allow the crown to exist. So
yeah,
if more people knew that, then they would realize their power and authority as individuals, as members of society, because actually we are the ultimate law in the land. The law of the land is the common law, and
hmm,
we exercise the common law through trial by jury. So
yeah,
it's us. We're actually in charge. That's the truth of the matter. That's something that has been obfuscated from us, I would argue, for 800 years. So,
yeah.
so we need to be familiarize ourselves with that. Now, I am not advocating. I am not advocating that we should, therefore support the monarchy. Right? It's the people. I think there's a distinction to be made between our constitutional heritage and the monarchy. They're not
Hmm.
they're not the same thing. There is
Yeah.
two different things there.
In 1649, St. George's Hill, a ragged band they called the Diggers came to show the people's will. They defied the landlords, they defied the laws. They was a dispossessed, reclaiming what was theirs. And I think
Reclaiming.
that's what we need to do. We need to reclaim what is ours, and that is always a feeling that is on the left and the right. I
You
mean,
go if you go back to
what?
Runnymede. Runnymede was not about establishing the crown. It wasn't. It
Mhm,
wasn't about establishing the common law. It was about reclaiming it. It
mhm.
already existed. It's a European tradition, the common law. It came over from Germany and France, and
And
in
it sticks for a reason.
it sticks for a reason. Yeah, because
It needs to be culturally significant to wherever it is at the time.
yeah,
Or
and we have the ability through it, something that people don't know. So currently, if you go onto Parliament's website, Parliament says I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it is something like Parliament is the supreme lawmaking body in the UK,
Mhm,
or in Britain, or whatever, however it's phrased. That's not true. That's not true. Juries have the power to annul legislation. We just
mhm.
don't know it because we're not told that by judges. Judges don't tell the jury that. But every jury, you go back to a case by a Penn and Mead, I think it was, a jury trial where the defendant was found guilty of breaking the law, but the jury refused to find him guilty. The jury refused. The jury foreman, the whole jury was put in prison over the weekend. They put they put the jury in prison, right, to force
We
them
don't
to.
want to force you to make a decision, but we want you to think about your decisions.
Yeah, so Penn, who was the foreman of the jury, he wouldn't allow this to happen. Penn then came back. They stuck to their guns, the jury. They came back and they said, no, we refuse to find this man guilty, because the main purpose of guilt is mens rea, which is a guilty mind. Somebody has to be shown to have willfully done something to harm somebody else, not made an act. Not, there's negligence as well. That's also a crime of criminal negligence. But nonetheless, someone has to have done something with the intent or through willful negligence to have caused harm to somebody else. If you don't think that, no matter what the law says, you can find somebody not guilty. You can say they're not guilty. So even if they've technically broken the law, you can say they're not guilty. Now, if they've technically broken the law and the jury says they're not guilty, then the problem is the law, not the individual. So the law is an ass. So at that point, you can annul the law. You can just say the law doesn't work in the case of this person and others like this person. Therefore, the law itself needs to be reassessed. Juries have that power. We, the people, can annul legislation. So when the Parliament says we are the supreme lawmaker in the land, that is simply a lie. It's not true, because we can annul it. They can pass whatever legislation they like, but in a jury trial, if things operated in a constitutionally coherent way, which they don't, but if they did, and this is the power of our constitution, we can annul that legislation and say, no, that law doesn't work. We don't like it. Get rid of it.
Yep. That's amazing stuff that the whole system is made in such a way that it has all of the possibility to change itself positively. It grasps onto the past and itself. It struggles to advance forward, and so instead mollycoddles itself, so that when you go into something, the only thing that can change it is the jury being awake, that small amount of people. And without that, everything goes out the window, because suddenly we're being tried by commission, aren't we?
Yeah, but I mean, that's the thing. In order for that to work, in order for that system to work, for jury systems to work as it was intended to work, and this goes back to the educational thing and the difference between a classical education, perhaps, and between the kind of comprehensive education that perhaps more of us are familiar with, is that everybody needs to understand it. Everybody needs to understand their responsibilities as an adult. So it is your duty. It is your duty under the Constitution. It is your duty to protect others around you, to cause no harm, to take responsibility for decision making, because at any one time you could be called up to be on a jury. So this is something that you have to be conscious of. You have to be actively engaged in the political process. That is democratia. That is the power of the people, where everybody is actively engaged in the process all the time, every day of their lives, because they, at some point, they may be asked to act as a juror, and acting as a juror is a very solemn undertaking. So if we had that, if that was the ethos of our culture and our society, which it was in before Runnymede, it was, then that would change everything. That would change it. We wouldn't be sat here talking, having, much of the stuff that is being just fed to us from some distant kind of quango that is pouring all this stuff onto us. We would naturally be resistant to it. Because it would be antithetical to our understanding of our duty as adults. That is something, that is a mindset change. So really, I'm not just suggesting that suddenly we could flip a switch and reinstitute some sort of constitutional arrangement and everything will be hunky-dory, but we have it within us as individuals to inform ourselves, be aware of our responsibilities and duties, and to act on them. And we can, but that needs to be done on a wide scale.
But I suggest the only thing that people should bear in mind is that if they keep their individual direction, their individual wants, their individual power, then being part of a collective means you get the right decisions at the end of it. If everybody involved cares about the things that make them human and ground them and take their decisions for the right reasons, you should get to a better direction than we've been going. This has been a brilliant conversation, Iain. Thanks,
No, I've
thanks
enjoyed
for
it,
having
mate.
it. Yeah. Well, thanks for giving me a good amount of your time, and we had a little bit of chat beforehand as well. And I think this is not going to be the last time. I now officially I owe you one. I owe you one. Let the
Oh, well, no,
public hear
I owe
that.
you.
No, come on. That's it. You
I'm
take
going to
it.
have to do podcasts now because I need to reciprocate the favor.
Yeah, well, I think you could find a lot of people who would be happy to talk to you on a podcast. I think you'd be a good podcast host. So do that. Where can people find you? What are you doing? What's going on in the world?
I haven't got a clue, mate. To be honest,
I know.
that's my problem. I'm just trying to figure it out. I don't understand any of it. You can find me at iaindavis.com. That's my website. It's spelled IAIN Davis.com.
Proper.
Yeah, proper way. Not the weird way, as some people say. That's how you spell it. That's the
down this way it gets to Iain.
Yeah.
You try spelling that, I can promise you it's harder.
Yeah. Also, as you said earlier, I'm very fortunate to write for Unlimited Hangout, for Geopolitics and Empire and UK Column. My work is also syndicated quite widely on other sites like Off Guardian. Off Guardian currently, they're one of the most censored sites in Britain, I would suggest, especially if you look at it from Twitter, and they deserve support because they're a kind of very good repository
Agreed.
for lots of different writers on lots of different subjects. So that's a really good site. And check me out. I'm currently writing my third book. That's going to be about the Ukraine situation and multipolarity. So I say I'm currently writing it. I've got no idea how long it's going to take, because what I'm not going to do is stop doing the other projects that I'm doing as well. So I'm going to try and do both. I'm not quite sure how that's panning out at the moment. I seem to be running around like a headless chicken at the moment, but
yeah, that's it. Well, thank you for coming on and speaking to me.
you.
And thank you for being on NEWSPASTE. Goodbye.
Tatty bye.
What we know is that we will end up with many more unemployed